Yeah, you can understand why Stephen King insisted that the on-screen writing credit go to Richard Bachman for this one. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 1987 dystopian action film, The Running Man. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content, like reviews, rank lists, and recommendations. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and even some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. The Running Man stars Arnold Schwarzenegger, María Conchita Alonso, and Richard Dawson, and was directed by Paul Michael Glaser. Very loosely based on Stephen King's 1982 novel of the same name, it tells the story of a dystopian society in which criminals are forced to compete in a deadly game show. You hear it all the time. Well, it wasn't as good as the book, but these types of book-to-movie comparisons have been being made for as long as book-to-movie adaptations have, and they tend not to be quite as kind to the film. I mean, it makes sense. Movies typically alter and condense what was in the book. It's only natural, given the amount of material and details that can fit in a couple hundred pages versus 2 hours of screen time. But movie adaptations typically try to stick at least somewhat close to the book. Sure, they may change a few details and cut some things out, but they usually still have the same core essence. They're still recognizable as being based on the book. This should especially be the case when you've got a Stephen King book on your hands. Okay, technically Richard Bachman, but the cat was already out of the bag on that by 1987. But sticking close to the book, being recognizable as the same story, was not the route they took with The Running Man. To be fair, it was originally planned to be a normal, reasonable adaptation, but with several director changes, the hiring of Arnold Schwarzenegger for the lead role, and script rewrites in the double digits, it eventually morphed into something almost unrecognizable. So, The Running Man deviates from the source material much more than your typical book-to-movie adaptation. The film still takes place in a dystopian future, and the economically depressed country is still obsessed with a violent game show called The Running Man, which eventually features a man named Ben Richards. But other than that, very little remains of the original story. In the movie, the deadly game show is completely contained within a large underground arena. The contestants are all criminals forced to participate gladiator style, and only an array of colorfully ridiculous killers called stalkers are out to get them. Despite the significant changes, this altered premise had potential in its own right, and still works within this dystopian totalitarian ruled setting. The criminal punishment angle adds an additional layer of darkness to the story, and this version of Richards, a former cop framed via media manipulation for refusing to carry out inhumane orders, manages to garner some innocent wrongman on the run sympathy. He's perhaps not quite as sympathetic or impactful as the original story's scrawny everyman Richards, who volunteers for the show, willingly sacrificing himself for the chance to get his family food and medical care. But the altered premise still stands strong among the plot changes. We can all think of a few adaptations that are only just barely loosely based on their source material. And we don't have to be book purists about it. Sometimes these changes can work, can update a story for a modern audience, can make the story function better in a film format than a more faithful adaptation ever could. And despite its significant plot changes, all of that could have been the case with The Running Man. It could have used its criminal punishment government control angle to its benefit to still tell a thought-provoking, thematically prominent dystopian survival thriller story. But instead, the film takes that premise and transforms it into a goofy sci-fi action comedy, whose drastic tonal shift feels jarring and ill-fitting for the plot at hand. The Running Man is still an incredibly violent, at times almost mean-spirited type of movie, but it quickly devolves into ooey-gooey 80s action cheese. It has an almost apocalyptic urban decay aesthetic, but is infused with so much 80s style that you'd think it was a modern parody rather than an actual film of the era. Bright neon spandex costumes, a synthy electric guitar-filled score, Schwarzenegger delivering a stream of action one-liners, including the one-liner that he's seemingly been contractually obligated to say in every movie since 1984. It's all so over the top and absurd that it actually manages to make the jump from eye-rolling cheese to chuckle-inducing camp. The stiff, uncomfortable acting from Schwarzenegger, the hammy, larger-than-life performance from Richard Dawson, playing an entertainingly twisted, bizarro version of his Family Feud persona, and of course, we can't forget about the ridiculous, almost cartoonish stalkers, played by an assortment of professional wrestlers and other celebrities. This movie features antagonists like Sub-Zero, a hockey-themed stalker who uses bladed hockey sticks and exploding pucks to ice his prey, or Buzzsaw and Fireball, whose respective chainsaws and flamethrowers feel almost tame in comparison to the utter absurdity of a character like Dynamo, with his light bright-inspired outfit and operatic serenades. It's all unbelievably dumb, but it gets so ridiculous that it's impossible not to be entertained at some level by the sheer WTF absurdity of it all. Ridiculous, campy 80s action cheese can undeniably be fun at times, and will no doubt be what most fans of this movie will point to for their reasoning. But unfortunately, there's just not much more to this adaptation of The Running Man beyond that. It had that still decent premise in spite of all the changes, but ultimately rings hollow with very little substance and even less of a plot. Along with its underwritten characters, the story's breakneck speed works against the film, resulting in something almost entirely free from tension that becomes dull and repetitive in spite of the action and 80s excess. This is a movie that focuses on a character who's on the run, but the scenarios he finds himself in are just variations of the same exact thing over and over again. What's fun at first loses its intrigue as we become desensitized to it. Ironic, considering public desensitization towards violence and suffering is one of the main themes of the original story. Instead, it's something that's only superficially glossed over here, as a framing device afterthought, along with the book's themes regarding class struggle, desperation, and the government's manipulation of its citizens in order to pacify and control. This movie forgoes the story's thought-provoking themes in favor of cheesy action and diversionary amusement, which is sadly very befitting of the story. The Running Man is entertaining in a limited sense, but there's just not enough there to sustain the movie or make it a particularly worthwhile adaptation. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The biggest pro is the premise. For most book-to-movie adaptations, credit for the premise usually goes to the author and the book, but this is a unique case, because very little of the book is actually present here. In fact, this movie has more in common with a 1983 French film called Les Prix du Danger, whose creators actually won a plagiarism lawsuit against this movie. Regardless, the premise here is an interesting idea that still conceptually works, despite being a far cry from the plot of the novel. It redirects the audience's sympathy from an everyman trying to provide for his family to an innocent man who's been framed for disobeying fascist orders. The added criminal element of the story here also feels in line with the dystopian urban apocalypse exploitation on display. So there's surprisingly a lot of potential with the premise. It just kind of falls apart during the execution. Pro number 2 is the campy fun. Although it's surely not the tone or style that Stephen King intended for the story, this movie is violent 80s camp to its core. Full of neon spandex suits and cheesy action one-liners, this film certainly delivers on over-the-top excessive action fun with its ridiculous costumes, sets, and cast of characters. The themed stalkers are especially absurd, from a killer hockey player with exploding pucks to a light bright opera singer chasing down the main character in a space-age dune buggy to the tune of Ride of the Valkyries. It's all unbelievably stupid, but kind of impossible not to be entertained by, at least in a bewildered WTF kind of way. On the con side, the biggest issue is how empty this movie is. It's undeniably entertaining at times, but offers nothing but popcorn-driven empty movie calories. Even putting aside the obvious changes from the book, a dystopic story like this should have teeth. It should have meaning and impact and something to say about its world and themes. But this is largely a movie without substance. All of those themes and thought-provoking ideas from the book are seemingly lost in translation. Or adaptation in this case. Instead, everything is shoehorned to fit around the action cheese, which itself was primarily crafted to pair with Arnold Schwarzenegger's casting as Ben Richards. Con number 2 has got to be the lack of tension. This is also partly a consequence of casting Schwarzenegger, but there's truly never a point in this film where you're concerned that Ben Richards is gonna fail. There's even a scene where the movie could have faked the audience out a bit, could have made us actually concerned for the well-being of this character. But instead, the screenplay goes out of its way to ensure that that doesn't happen. Really, the first 10 minutes or so offer the most excitement and suspense you're gonna get. After that, it just rushes through the story with a lot of action repetition that prevents any real suspense or tension from building. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying The Running Man or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies or anything else. I'm gonna give The Running Man 3 out of 5 paws, though this is a very low 3, right on the cusp of being a 2.5. This movie has an interesting enough dystopian premise, but strays too far from its thought-provoking source material into something much more absurd. This is the epitome of 80s action cheese, full of one-liners and neon spandex, but lacking in nearly all substance. It's violent and repetitive, but has plenty of extremely campy fun that's hard to like, but even harder not to enjoy, at least on some level. I would recommend The Running Man to fans of cheesy 80s action movies. This movie is so violent, so over the top, but also bizarrely so goofy. Arnold Schwarzenegger is doing all of the accented grunting and one-liners you'd expect, including the one-liner you always expect from him. This film's pretty cheap looking and more than just a little mean-spirited, but it's just oozing neon and stylized urban decay. If you want to turn your brain off and munch popcorn 80s Schwarzenegger film, you could do worse than this one. But if you want a movie with a modicum of thematic intelligence or something closer to Stephen King's original story, you can only do better. If you liked The Running Man, I would recommend Demolition Man. This early 90s sci-fi actioner stars Sylvester Stallone as a loose cannon cop who's set up and cryogenically imprisoned, only to be thawed 36 years later to apprehend a criminal. There's some 80s action holdover here, but it's got a fun fish-out-of-water premise, less cheese, and a much more compelling story. If you'd prefer some more 80s action cheese with a little more plot, you might want to check out Escape from New York. Set in a then futuristic 1997, this John Carpenter movie focuses on a walled-off Manhattan, which has been turned into a deadly free-roaming maximum security prison. When Air Force One crashes within the walls, a former Special Forces prisoner is given 24 hours to rescue the president in exchange for a pardon. And if you just like the idea of The Running Man, you should watch the 2025 version of The Running Man. Now, I get it, recommending a remake isn't exactly the most creative suggestion, but in this case, it's actually a pretty significant change. The new adaptation sticks much closer to the plot of the book. It still has action and some comedy, but Edgar Wright in the director's chair and the ever-charismatic Glenn Powell as the lead make a big difference. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen The Running Man? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's a book that you wish had a more faithful movie adaptation than it currently does? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe if you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.